In part number 2, I focus on the shelf supports, making the box joints, the dovetails, cutting the grooves for the panels, and adding a chamfer. Just got done planing all the shelving supports that'll be along the A-frames here. Before I started planing them, I actually ran them all through the bandsaw, kind of like a resaw, just because they're all different thicknesses. So in order to make the planing a little bit shorter and less noisy and less dusty, I just went through and cut everything through on the bandsaw. Here's all the scraps. And then I took it over the planer, and I'll take you over there now, show you what I got. So here's all the material after planing. You can see I got all the varying thicknesses, or not thicknesses, lengths and widths. The next thing I need to do is rip all these to width at the table saw, which I'm going to do next here. And then after that, it's going to be laying out some of the joinery that'll hold the shelves and tie the supports together. You can kind of see the shelving material has been sitting over here for a couple days now after I resawed that on the bandsaw. It's just been sitting and hanging out. After ripping all the pieces to the same width at 2 inches, I then moved on to cutting all the rear shelf supports, the ones that span left to right between the A-frames, to the same length. After I did that, I cut the side pieces, the left and right pieces that come forward, cut them to just a rough length. I'll do the final dimensioning of those once I get a dry fit of the whole A-frame shelf. What you can see here is I'm laying out the box joints that are going to support the corners, the rear corners between the left, right, and the rear support piece. And I'm setting up my Incra box joint jig, and I've done some test cuts. And here I'm running through all the actual box joint cutting on the shelves. All right, so I'm in the process of kind of visualizing what the finished A-frame shelf is going to look like. I'm just roughly laying out where the shelves are going to go on one half of the A-frame here. You can kind of see the kind of the overall size of it and what's going on here. So each one of the shelving support pieces is got box joints in the rear, and then my next step of the project here is to be lay out some small stretchers that go from this end of the shelf up to this end of the shelf, just keeping the front square for each one. And I'm going to do that by using some small dovetails in each end, and then just a thin strip. So I have the lumber for the dovetailed stretchers over there. I milled it up last night. I'm going to mill it again here quick this morning, and then start working on the stretchers. After milling the small stretchers for the dovetails, I then ripped them all to width, which was just a little over an inch. I think it was 1 1/8 inches. And then here I'm cutting them all to the same length, which represents the width that I desire for the front of the shelf to match the rear. Alright, so I'm moving on to cutting the dovetails in the end of the long stretchers between the shelves. What you can see here is my test piece, just a small dovetail cut in the end. And so what I'm going to try to use is this little simple homemade jig. And so what it does, the workpiece butts up against that front fence there, like so, and then it slides along the fence of the bandsaw. I have a magnetic block set up as a depth stop on the back side of the bandsaw. So try to do this with one hand here. Excuse the shaky footage. So as I'm cutting, slide through, it hits the stop, back it out, flip it over, one-handed, pass it through again, and there's the two cuts for the dovetail. So here's a couple of sample pieces here's a couple pieces that have worked out. As you can see, they're cut through. In similar fashion, I'm going to cut the shoulders of the dovetail using a miter gauge and a magnetic block as my depth stop here. You can see slicing through the shoulder of the dovetail, flip it, and repeat. The dovetails aren't perfect by any means, but they're definitely functional. Alright, so next here I'm going to be inserting these little dovetail rails or supports into the shelf support. So you can see the corners already had the box joints cut into them. They're already kind of lightly assembled. So the first thing I do is locate the bottom of the shelf support. Going to put this in the clamps just to apply some pressure. Not going together that well. Let's see. All right, and so I roughly marked, I've kind of marked where the front of this shelf will end. I did some relative measurements to the A-frames, and so I'm going to measure back a certain distance. It's kind of arbitrary as long as both the shelf supports are equal for the two shelves. So just going to get a rough idea where this goes. Probably going to be somewhere in here, let's call it. So that's my alignment mark on this side, and then my alignment mark on this side. And then so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut off, basically cut off the back side of this dovetail here just a little bit, really for two reasons. One, it really helps align this thing when you're laying it out, and then two, you don't have to chop as deep to get the dovetail, and then you don't have to go down half the distance. So I'm going to do the table saw real quick, and I'm going to move the camera here. Alright, so I did that quick cut at the table saw. I just have a standard blade in there and just kind of cut it, do the first cut at the shoulder, and then work my way back and kind of move it back and forth to smooth it out. So you'll see what I mean when it kind of helps with the alignment. It kind of just, you put it in there, and that shoulder helps maintain its position while I knife out the tails. And I'm using those previous alignment marks just to line the edge of the board. All right, and before I take these away, put some marks on there so I line them so they go back in the same holes. All right, and this is piece number G. So next thing I'm going to do is I have my combination square set to the depth of the tail. And I'm just going to lay out where the depth of this on the board, and the two edges of the tail as well as they come down through the depth. All right, next step, going to use my pole saw here just to make some kerfs on the two angled sides of the tail. Get some coffee first. And so what was probably hard to see on camera, unfortunately, was what I was doing there. So I put my fingernail in the knife cut, and then I saw down. If I can get this damn camera situated, Jesus. There we go. So it might be a little bit easier to see, but here's my knife line, and there's my saw kerf right inside of it. I just found that by doing that and then chiseling back to my line seems to be a lot better fit than actually using the saw on that kerf line there. So then the rest of it is all basically chisel work. And luckily I made these wide enough that my 1/2-inch chisel just fits inside of it. So that was a happy accident, because I didn't intend to do that, but I'm glad it worked out that way. And there's a completed dovetail. I knew when I chiseled that little thing there, I knew I got out of the knife line when I hit that, so that's too bad. But this one fits pretty good though, nice and solid. Little gap on the end line. Seems like I can't never get that cleanly where there's no gap up at the top. But the depth's good too. It's nice and flush. So moving on to the next one. So if you can see my knife lines here, I'll color them in. There you can kind of see what the knife line looks like. And like I said, I put my fingernail in there. And I'm just checking that my saw kerf just gets up to the knife line but doesn't go past it. All right, now choppy choppy. Just actually laying that probably come down. Try for the material from the edges. There it goes. There, that's a little bit better fit. Not much. All right, so I just finished up routing all the grooves for the panels. I'll show you what those look like here. So it's a 1/4 inch diameter groove, wide groove, whatever. That's 5/16 inch deep. And the height of it, so this is the bottom of each shelf. And here's where the dovetail stretcher goes in. And then the panel will slide in this groove, and the panel is a little bit over a 1/4 inch thick. So what I'm going to do is I've spaced this out so I can take just a little bit off the bottom of the panel so it slides in there. And then that'll still clear this top support, which eventually this bottom support. The bottom support will eventually get some elongated holes, and that's what's going to screw and hold that panel in place so it can't slide out of the shelf. After getting all the joinery complete on the shelf supports, I went through a round of sanding on everything, 100, 120, and 150 with a wet sand in there on all the internal surfaces. I did the external as well. What you saw in the beginning was me showing the numbers on the bottom of the shelf supports. With 10 different shelf supports and 10 different shelves, it was important that I kept everything in order and with each other, since the dovetails were hand cut. The box joints needed to be flushed up with each other, so I ended up buying a little number stamp kit, which came in really handy in this project, and I will definitely be using it in the future. During the glue up, I'm just using a little wooden stick like a little popsicle stick to spread the glue in the box joint, and then the same through the dovetail. On this specific shelf support, I need to apply some additional pressure fore aft, that the box joint wasn't coming together very tight. Most of the other ones I didn't have to do that. I just was able to get them tight by hand and then just apply pressure side to side. During the glue up, I'm checking square with this with a square I have here. Once I got all of the shelf supports glued up and the glue was dry, I took them out the clamps. I decided I wanted to add a large chamfer on the internal upper edges of all the shelf supports, so as you're reaching in there, grabbing things out, there's more of a gradual edge to avoid getting anything caught on like hand or whatever. So I'm using my router table to cut those large chamfers. I have a chamfer bit, and I'm just going around the internal perimeter here on my router table. After the router table work, it's time to complete the corners. With this, a chisel is the best tool to use. Just find the back surface, or find the chamfer surface with the chisel, and kind of work your way into the corner. And when you get in there, you have to rotate it up at an angle so they meet the correct spot. One thing you can notice in the video here is how I'm consistently switching back and forth on the two sides of the chamfer. If you go all the way on one side, you'll end up either popping the corner out or getting some tear out or something like that. So I just like going back and forth and taking it slow and steady to get a nice crisp corner. Another thing you may notice is there are holes drilled and some counter bores drilled on the interior sides of the shelf support. I did that after everything was glued up and after it was all laid out as a kind of a dry fit to get the position of the shelves on the A-frame. And I drilled them and counterbored them. They'll get plugged later on, which you'll see in a future video. The very last step for the shelf supports was to carry the chamfer down the very front interior edges, and doing this was accomplished using a block plane and then some light sanding to soften the sharp edges. This about does it for the shelf supports, as well as for part number 2 in this build series. Please keep following along as I continue on the build of these A-frame shelves, and please like or subscribe the video and leave any comments.